It was just another ordinary day at the upscale boutique where Emma worked, or so she thought. The morning had started like any other, unfolding with the usual rhythm of arranging designer handbags, straightening racks of luxury dresses, and preparing for the day's customers. Emma had been working there for 3 years, and she prided herself on her ability to read people the moment they walked through the door. She could spot a high spender from a mile away, and just as easily, she could tell when someone was just browsing, wasting her time. So, when he walked in, she didn't think much of him. He looked ordinary, a little scruffy, wearing a plain hoodie and jeans that didn't scream wealth. Definitely not the kind of customer who could afford the $5,000 handbags she was selling. Little did she know, this man was about to turn her world upside down in a way she never saw coming. Emma greeted him with her usual polite but distant smile, the kind she reserved for customers she didn't expect to buy anything. She asked if he needed help, and he simply shook his head, saying he was just looking. Typical, she thought. Another broke guy pretending to be interested in luxury goods. She rolled her eyes as soon as he turned his back, already mentally checking out of the interaction. But as the minutes ticked by, something felt off. He wasn't just browsing. He was studying the store, the layout, the employees, even the way the products were displayed. It was almost as if he was evaluating the place, but for what? Emma brushed it off, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. After all, what could someone like him possibly have to do with a high-end boutique like this? Meanwhile, across town, a boardroom was buzzing with tension. A major decision was being made, one that would send shockwaves through the company that owned the boutique. The CEO, a man known for his sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude, had just made a bold move. He had decided to personally inspect one of the stores under his empire, an undercover visit to see how things were really being run. He wasn't dressed in his usual tailored suit or carrying the air of authority he was known for. Instead, he chose to blend in, to observe without being noticed. And that's exactly what he did when he walked into Emma's boutique that day. Back in the store, Emma's patience was wearing thin. The man was still there, lingering near the cash register. And now he was asking questions that felt oddly specific. "How long have you worked here?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Emma answered curtly, her tone laced with barely concealed annoyance. She didn't have time for this. She had real customers to attend to, people who actually looked like they belonged in a place like this. But then, he dropped a bombshell. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm, "customer service is the backbone of any business. And from what I've seen today, yours is lacking." Emma froze. Who did this guy think he was, lecturing her about customer service? She opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could say a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Her eyes scanned it, and her heart dropped. The name on the card was one she recognized instantly. It was the CEO of the company that owned the boutique. Her stomach churned as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random customer. This was the man who held her job in his hands. And from the look on his face, he wasn't impressed. The room seemed to spin as he spoke again, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice steady but cold. "You're fired." Emma's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. How could this be real? How could she have misjudged him so badly? She wanted to argue, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, stunned, as he turned and walked out of the store, leaving her career in ruins. But this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was only the beginning. Because what Emma didn't know was that this wasn't just about her. The CEO's visit was part of a larger plan, one that would reveal secrets about the boutique and about Emma herself that no one saw coming. As she stood there, clutching the business card in her trembling hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And she was right, because sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most unexpected opportunities. But for Emma, the question remained, would this be her downfall or her second chance? Emma stood frozen in the middle of the boutique, the CEO's business card clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, anger, embarrassment, and a creeping sense of dread. How could she have been so blind? How could she have misjudged him so completely? She replayed the interaction in her head, every word, every glance, searching for the moment she should have realized who he was. But there was nothing. He had played his part perfectly, and she had fallen right into the trap. The other employees were staring at her now, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and pity. Emma could feel their gazes burning into her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. She was too busy trying to process what had just happened. Fired. Just like that. No warning, no second chance. One moment, she was at the top of her game, the star employee who knew every customer by name and could sell a $10,000 handbag to anyone who walked through the door. And now, she was nothing. Just another person who had underestimated the wrong man. But as the initial shock began to wear off, a new emotion started to take hold. Anger. Who did he think he was, coming into her store and humiliating her like that? Sure, maybe she hadn't been her usual cheerful self that day, but who could blame her? It had been a long week, and she was tired. Didn't she deserve a little slack? And besides, what kind of CEO goes around firing people on the spot without even giving them a chance to explain themselves? It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Emma's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her manager's voice. Emma, he said, his tone a mix of sympathy and frustration. I think you should go home for the day. We'll figure this out tomorrow. She nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak. Grabbing her bag from the employee locker, she walked out of the boutique without a backward glance. The sun was blinding as she stepped outside, and for a moment, she just stood there, blinking in the light. The world felt surreal, like she was walking through a dream or a nightmare. As she made her way home, Emma's mind continued to race. What was she going to do now? She had bills to pay, rent due at the end of the month, and no savings to fall back on. The boutique had been her life for the past 3 years, and she had never imagined it could all be taken away so quickly. She thought about calling her mom, but the idea of explaining what had happened made her stomach churn. Her mom had always been so proud of her, bragging to her friends about how her daughter worked at one of the most exclusive boutiques in the city. How could she tell her that she had been fired? And in such a humiliating way. When Emma finally got home, she collapsed onto the couch, her body feeling heavy with exhaustion. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts, but she didn't know who to call. Her friends would want to know what happened, and she wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. Instead, she opened her email, half hoping there would be some kind of explanation or apology from the company. But her inbox was empty, except for a few spam messages and a reminder about her upcoming dentist appointment. As the hours passed, Emma's anger began to simmer, replaced by a growing sense of curiosity. Who was this CEO, really? She had heard his name before. Of course, Daniel Carter. He was a legend in the retail world, known for turning struggling companies into billion-dollar empires. But she had never seen him in person, never even thought about what he might be like. And now, after their brief encounter, she couldn't stop thinking about him. There was something about the way he had looked at her, something in his eyes, that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just anger or disappointment. It was something else, something deeper. Emma grabbed her laptop and started searching for information about Daniel Carter. The results were overwhelming. There were articles about his rise to success, interviews where he talked about his business philosophy, and countless photos of him at charity events and industry conferences. He was handsome, she had to admit, with sharp features and a confident smile. But there was also something intimidating about him, something that made her feel small just looking at his picture. As she scrolled through the articles, one detail caught her eye. Daniel Carter was known for his hands-on approach to management. He didn't just sit in his office and delegate. He liked to be involved in every aspect of his businesses, from the boardroom to the sales floor. And apparently, that included undercover visits to his stores. Emma's stomach twisted as she realized that this wasn't the first time he had done something like this. There were stories of other employees who had been fired on the spot, managers who had been demoted, even entire stores that had been shut down after his visits. He was ruthless, they said, a man who didn't tolerate mistakes or mediocrity. But as Emma kept reading, she noticed something else. Despite his reputation for being tough, Daniel Carter was also known for giving second chances. There were stories of employees who had been given opportunities to prove themselves after failing, of stores that had been turned around under his guidance. It was a strange contradiction, and it left her feeling even more confused. Was there a chance he might reconsider her firing? Or was she just grasping at straws, hoping for a miracle that would never come? The sound of her phone buzzing snapped Emma out of her thoughts. It was a text from her best friend, Jess. "Hey, you okay? Heard something happened at work." Emma hesitated, then typed out a quick reply. "Yeah, not great. Can we talk later?" Jess responded immediately. "Of course. Call me whenever." Emma sighed, grateful for the support, but still not ready to talk about what had happened. She needed more time to process everything, to figure out what she was going to do next. As the evening wore on, Emma found herself scrolling through job listings, but nothing seemed right. She had spent years building her career at the boutique, and the idea of starting over somewhere else felt overwhelming. But what choice did she have? She couldn't just sit around and wait for Daniel Carter to change his mind. She needed to take control of her life, to find a way to move forward. But how? Just as she was about to close her laptop, an email notification popped up. It was from an unknown sender, and the subject line made her heart skip a beat. An opportunity. Emma clicked on it, her hands trembling slightly. The message was short and to the point. "Miss Thompson, I believe we got off on the wrong foot today. I'd like to discuss a potential opportunity. Please meet me at my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Sincerely, Daniel Carter." Emma stared at the screen, her mind racing. What did this mean? Was he offering her a second chance? Or was this some kind of cruel joke? She didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear: she couldn't ignore it. Whatever was going to happen next, she needed to face it head on. But as she closed her laptop and tried to prepare for the meeting, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and much more complicated than she had ever imagined. The next morning, Emma woke up with a knot in her stomach. She had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about what Daniel Carter could possibly want from her. Was this a second chance, or was he just toying with her? She dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that was professional but not overly formal: a blazer, a simple blouse, and tailored pants. She wanted to look confident, but not desperate. As she stood in front of the mirror, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This meeting could change everything, and she couldn't afford to mess it up. The address Daniel had provided led her to a sleek, modern office building in the heart of the city. The lobby was all glass and steel, with a reception desk that looked more like a piece of art than a functional workspace. Emma gave her name to the receptionist, who nodded and directed her to the elevators. "Mr. Carter is expecting you," she said with a polite smile. Emma's heart pounded as she stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind her with a soft whoosh. She pressed the button for the top floor, her hand trembling slightly. When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by a stunning view of the city skyline. The office was spacious and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of natural light. Daniel Carter was sitting at a large desk, his back to the windows, typing something on his laptop. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Thompson," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please have a seat." Emma sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She waited for him to speak, but he seemed in no hurry. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp, piercing eyes. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. "I fired you yesterday because your attitude was unacceptable. But I also saw something in you: potential. You're smart, you're driven, and you know the retail business inside and out. That's why I'm giving you a chance to prove yourself." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of chance?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I have a project in mind, one that requires someone with your skills. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be glamorous. But if you succeed, it could change everything, for you and for the company." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Are you interested?" Emma hesitated. She didn't know what to say. On one hand, this was an opportunity to redeem herself, to prove that she was more than just a mistake. On the other hand, she didn't trust Daniel Carter. There was something about him that made her uneasy, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. But what choice did she have? She needed this. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm interested." Daniel nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good. I'll have my assistant send you the details. But before we go any further, there's something you need to understand. This project is confidential. You can't talk about it with anyone, not your friends, not your family, not even your coworkers. If word gets out, the deal is off." "Understood." Emma nodded. though the secrecy made her even more nervous. What kind of project required this level of confidentiality? But she didn't dare ask. Instead, she thanked him and stood up to leave. As she walked back to the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something much bigger and much more dangerous than she had anticipated. Meanwhile, across town, Jess was sitting in her apartment, staring at her phone. She had tried calling Emma several times, but her calls kept going to voicemail. She was worried. Emma had always been the strong one, the one who had everything under control. But something about her text last night had felt off. Jess decided to stop by Emma's place after work, just to check on her. She had a bad feeling, and she couldn't ignore it. Back at the office, Daniel watched as Emma stepped into the elevator. Once the doors closed, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "She's in," he said simply before hanging up. He leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. Everything was going according to plan. As Emma left the building, she felt a mix of emotions: relief, excitement, and a lingering sense of unease. She checked her phone and saw several missed calls from Jess. She knew she should call her back, but she wasn't ready to explain what was happening. Not yet. Instead, she decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. But as she wandered through the city streets, her mind kept going back to Daniel's words. What kind of project was he talking about? And why had he chosen her? Unbeknownst to Emma, she was being watched. A man in a dark coat stood on the corner, his eyes following her as she walked. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. "She's on the move." The reply came almost instantly. "Keep an eye on her. We can't afford any mistakes." Emma turned a corner, her thoughts still racing. She didn't notice the man following her, didn't see the way his eyes never left her. She was too caught up in her own world, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But one thing was clear: her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. And not all of those changes would be for the better. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Emma finally headed home. She still didn't have any answers, but she knew one thing for sure: she was in over her head. And the deeper she got, the harder it would be to find her way out. But for now, all she could do was wait and see what happened next. The game had begun, and she was just a pawn in a much larger plan. The question was, would she be able to play along, or would she be swept away by the tide? Only time would tell.